few weeks ago, I sat before a man who, in the company of strangers, sat with his head bowed and his hands open in his lap. He was a man in his 60s with cropped gray hair. He wore an iron shirt and a nice tie. He spoke plainly and slowly, and he said, "I know I don't deserve to be here. I've spent the last 30 years actively harming the people in this room. I beg for your forgiveness." We were quiet. It was a Tuesday morning in early September in Auburndale, Massachusetts. We were a small community of people, mostly Jews and some Christian pastors, sitting in the Beit Midrash, or the house of study at Hebrew College. Reverend Dr. Robert Schenk is an evangelical pastor. He has spent much of his life on a much more public stage than where I first encountered him. Born into a Jewish family, he was a rebellious teen who at age 16 was baptized and born again in the Niagara River in New York. He was and is a natural leader and very captivating speaker, and he gained public attention quickly. In 1995, he founded the organization Faith in Action in Washington, D.C., a group that targeted elected officials and Supreme Court justices to advocate against same-sex marriage and abortion access, central goals in the right-wing evangelical movement that he was part of. The founder of an anti-abortion organization, he recruited and trained thousands of protesters to block the doors of clinics and protest people seeking and providing abortion care. His work, which was central to his own theology, was personal for others too. One of the physicians who was a target of his activism, Dr. Barnett Slepian, an abortion provider in Buffalo, New York, was shot and killed in his own home. When Reverend Schenk sent flowers to his wife, the wife of the widow of the man who was murdered, she sent them back smashed, expressing that he was responsible for her husband's murder. For Reverend Schenk, this tragedy was a turning point. He began to ask himself about his own certainty, asking, are we as good as we think we are? With patience, support, and some prodding from his spouse, his children, and a therapist, Reverend Schenk began to go through a process of transformation that would last 2 decades and still counting. He calls the process a gradual churning. Very beautiful. And I want to call this process today Tshuva, return, repentance, changing toward, one of the core pieces of spiritual work that we as Jews are instructed to undergo during this high holiday season. In the years to come, Reverend Schenk's life became unrecognizable. He reflected, in this period of time, he was once more born again, but this time just another type of birth. He began to believe that his community had abandoned their focus on Jesus in favor of an interest in political and financial power, and he really sought to find his way back to his own faith. The process transformed his own marriage and brought him back into contact with the son he hadn't spoken to in a decade. His politics, too, took a real 180, crystallized in a new political stance on reproductive freedom. He began to understand that maybe it wasn't his place to legislate for women and those who give birth regarding an experience that he couldn't understand. In 2019, he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times expressing his support for Roe v. Wade, calling on his readers, people in the movement he poured so much life into, to put your money where your mouth is. Devote yourself and your considerable resources to taking care of poor women and their children before you champion laws that hem them into impossible situations. And he did, and still does, devote himself. To address the years of harm he caused, he served on the board of the U.S. Black Women's Chamber of Commerce, supports the ACLU, and founded an organization actually named after a Jewish philosopher that advocates for gun control and a compassionate approach to immigration. He was recently hired by Hebrew College, the rabbinical school where I'm also a student, their Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership, where he teaches courses alongside rabbis, focused on Christian nationalism and interfaith understanding. On a personal level, as a preacher, and he's still a preacher, he now focuses on supporting others to foster curiosity and compassion, encouraging them to question if they are indeed as right as they think they are. Reverend Dr. Shank's story has become an earworm for me. I frankly can't stop thinking about him, particularly in this season. What an arc, and what unimaginable courage to undertake a reflective process that was so cutting and required so many sacrifices. It's really a lightning bolt of a teaching, a reminder of how Tshuva is ultimately about encountering our reality fully and embarking on an earnest reordering of the soul. So what exactly are we talking about when we talk about Tshuva? Perhaps it's a new idea for some of us. Perhaps we understand it through the feeling of guilt in the pit of our stomachs when the leaves start to turn. Perhaps it's a meaningful spiritual process, which we undergo guided by Musar. Perhaps it's Slichot. So enter Rabbi Moses ben Maimonides, or the Rambam, a person by many names, who has his own answer. He was born in 1135 in Spain, and Rambam, the doctor and philosopher, wrote his really magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, to create a clear and practical guide for Jews everywhere to follow. So to make this tradition accessible, he gathered information from the Mishnah and the Talmud and created a work that even now still acts as a central guide on the big ideas and also the nuts and bolts of Jewish life. So let's just take a moment to look into that text on Tshuva, what he says about Tshuva in the Mishnah Torah. So one of the first things we learn about Tshuva actually begins with Rambam's editorial choice. Where in the Mishnah Torah he actually decides to write about Tshuva. These teachings don't appear in sections on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, but rather they appear in the Sefer HaMadah, the Book of Knowledge, a section that really talks about the core elements of Jewish spiritual life. Scholar, theologian, and philosopher Shai Held points out how this placement shows us that Tshuva has a much deeper role than just popping up during the high holidays. Tshuva, the spiritual work of return, is at the heart of what it means to lead a Jewish life. So how do we do it? The Rambam lays out 5 steps, this path, 5-ish steps, but Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, in her remarkable book, which I really recommend to everyone, On Repentance and Repair, Making Amends in an Unapologetic World, she really takes our hand and helps us understand Rambam's teaching in our contemporary moment. So these 2 sages will kind of support us in our learning. So step 1, Rambam teaches us that the first step is to call out before God. And this is an act in 2 parts. First, name the harm that you've caused out loud. Say the facts. Secondly, and crucially, seek to understand it. This is a task that's done by cheshbon nefesh, or an accounting of the soul. This work of accounting is reflective. We must see and investigate the harm that we've caused, the hurt that we've caused. We're meant to get curious and ask, what do we do? What was the impact? How might the other person feel? Simple questions. And when we have a sense of this, which is no small task, We speak it out loud in a public setting that's appropriate for the situation. For example, "Hey Dad, I know I didn't follow up with you after your surgery. I see that makes you feel neglected." Or, "I ignored the allegations of harassment because I was scared of the legal consequences. Now I realize that I've really harmed the people I supervised." Rabbi Ruttenberg is careful to note this is actually not an apology, but a declarative statement. This is where we just step into our own accountability. This isn't a moment to seek pardon. We simply state what we did out loud, and we are seen, and we are heard. Step one. The next step is more complex. We seek to change. The key word is seek. Full tshuva, tshuva gemorah, writes the Rambam, only happens when the person has the opportunity and ability to commit the same harm but chooses otherwise, not because of her lack of strength or fear, but because of her own growth, like Rabbi Lisa mentioned earlier. So how to change? It's a big question. Perhaps we grapple tearfully in prayer, or perhaps we make financial sacrifices by distributing material resources. Perhaps we pursue therapy or rehab, new perspectives. But as anyone who knows who's tried to pursue a new coping mechanism or change a difficult pattern in a relationship, this takes time. Months, years, or until the end of our lives. Think of our Reverend, who understands his own ongoing transformation to have spanned 2 decades and still counting. Step 3. Restitution and acceptance of consequences. These amends, like really every piece of the Tshuva project, are very context-specific. So this could mean, what might the victim want? Do they need support with a therapeutic process? Do they need someone to step down from a role? Why must our amends be so concrete? Imagine if a person who stole your bike years ago bought you a new bike. Through this, you might understand that they understood the harm, reflected on it, and sought to repair it. And you have a new bike. So the 4th step is to apologize. The Rambam writes, after the amends are done, a person is obliged to beg for forgiveness. They must appease and implore until the forgiven party forgives them. So again, our tradition teaches, and Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg is very sure to put an accent, a dagesh, like an emphasis on this. There's a big difference between repentance and forgiveness. The person pursuing tshuva has to seek repair, and the other person can forgive them if they wish, but this isn't the point. This process moves at the level of relationship. A person undergoes tshuva in order to return home to their own ethical center, to get right with God, as Rabbi Ruttenberg says. This is an expression of care, ultimately. And the forgiveness might happen in the process, or it's possible one might never be forgiven, and this too is part of the work to accept this. Step 5, make different choices. Tshuva gemorah, this full repentance, blooms when we're able to transform our own behavior. And Rambam writes really rather colorfully, kind of love this, anyone who verbalizes his confession without resolving in his heart to abandon the harm can be compared to a person who immerses oneself in a ritual bath while holding the carcass of a lizard in their hand. Their immersion will not be valid until they cast away the carcass. It's pretty good. We're asked to loosen our hands on the grip of that lizard, of how we have caused pain, belittled a loved one, taken something that isn't ours, and just, let it drop. And this is really grueling work. It's not easy. So with respect to Danya's and Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg's and Rambam's list of 5, I want to just add 1 6th piece, that the gates of compassion are always open in this process. The Rambam writes how that even if someone transgressed their whole life, if they do tshuva on the day of their deathbed and they die in, this process, or after this process, they're completely forgiven. So Tshuva, he teaches, is really possible in every moment. It's just during these days of awe, in these moments that we're in, that they're kind of immediately accepted. It's like the volume's turned up. So just imagine that, that a sea of compassion really awaits us. So I want to return for a moment to our good Reverend, and I'll look back into his story with this framework. So 1, the Reverend calls out to God. 2, he names the harm in his relationships and actions and does this remarkable process of repair in his own family. 3, he begins to make amends, donating time for study, material resources, and his own attention towards repairing the structural harm that he created. 4, he apologizes, which I saw, and it was remarkable. And 5, now this Tshuva Gemara, full Tshuva, he is open-minded enough to engage with weird Jews like myself who approach him on a Tuesday in Elul and inform him that actually for decades he's been doing Tshuva. So on this Tuesday, I confided in him, listen, when you asked for forgiveness, I felt it, like in the center of my chest. I really felt that. And I asked one, seeker to another, how did you do this? How did you undergo this process? And he paused for a moment, and then he said, first, I have to get on my knees and beg for forgiveness. He took a breath in, paused, and released it. One has to live with a certain amount of agony. And yes, it can be agonizing. Many of us are raised to feel that if we encounter disharmony in our political lives, we've failed. That we could have avoided it if we were purer, kinder, better behaved, better. But it's not true. Harm happens. We take when we shouldn't. We blame others to avoid responsibility. We break others' hearts. We violate boundaries. We isolate others with our actions. We harm inadvertently and on purpose. Ashamnu, bagadnu. We feel this grief and we regret this brokenness. But Tshuva offers us something, the refuge of knowing that this is actually our nature and that repair is possible. Beautifully, it's the recognition of this harm and the instruction to work with it that alights transformational benefit. The Reverend's heartbreak at the tragic murder of this abortion provider renewed his heart. Tshuva directs us to feel this pain that we wish we didn't or wouldn't cause others, and directs our careful attention to trying to understand it. Stephen Folder, a meditation teacher I had the privilege of studying with this past winter in the north of Israel, told us as we peered into our hearts, which were full of fear and grief and heartbreak, and said that attention is the beginning of compassion. Attention is the beginning of compassion. If we pay attention to the harm that we do, and crucially, those who we have harmed, the heart might just swell with compassion. In this process, we might encounter our nascent desire for tshuva. We might, like a seed pushing against the hard ground, feel this yearning for renewal. When we pursue tshuva, we pursue the gradual churning of transformation of ourselves, our relationships, and of structures of harm that harm ourselves and others. It's so challenging and such beautiful work to partake in. It's so deeply worth it. On Rosh Hashanah, as we prepare for another stroll through the same stories in our Jewish year, as we do. Some have a custom of wearing a new piece of clothing or putting a new fruit on the table on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. We anticipate a return to the beginning of creation. Nashuv, we return. And as we return again, perhaps paradoxically, we say the Shechianu, this prayer for new things. Tshuva offers us the hope of how, through encountering the new, we return home. And in returning home, we begin anew. As we head into these 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I want to bless you that as you step into this process of tshuva with ever scale and direct attention to your own experience and actions, that this will seed new compassion. I want to bless us that in the coming year, this compassionate attention will be a source of renewal, comfort, and connection for each of us and all living beings. And I want to bless you with the wisdom of our ancestors who teach us that when we lower ourselves to our knees and beg for forgiveness, so too we orient our hearts and our hands towards repair. And that, from this place, on the ground, we see that the gates are open and the new fruit waiting to ripen in our hands. Shana Tova.